What happened that afternoon in Pasadena didn't just crown a champion, it changed the national map of the sport.
Well, I think it's impossible to overstate the importance of that season and this game, right? Tommy can talk a lot about the season itself. When you look back at it, and we're up on the 100th anniversary now, it's just incredible to look back and see the impact that season, and particularly the Rose Bowl victory itself had on Alabama football. We're 100 years out and we're not forgetting it. That's how big it was.
But the 25 season is what we're here to talk about. And the great thing about this team was 21 of the 24 on the roster were from the state of Alabama.
Hmm.
And if you look down at their roster, it's small town Alabama, it's small town America, that made up this roster. That was the only game in town. The season was great, and there were no rankings at the time. All we knew was we finished 9-0, and talk started happening toward the end of the season about maybe we could get out west and go to the Rose Bowl and how important that would be.
University of Washington, which Alabama would eventually play, had played there a couple of years before Alabama played them. They had an experience that, they weren't happy with everything. So one of the things that made a point of mentioning in his column one time was the fact that the West Coast players were, the players on Alabama's team were known by some of the readers in West Coast newspapers, and Johnny Mack Brown, Philly Hubert. So the talk really started ramping up. Alabama and Tulane were fighting for the Southern Conference championship. They weren't playing each other, but they were playing. There were 22 teams in this conference. So it wasn't decided at that point who would be the Southern Conference champion. They beat Georgia 27-0 at Legion Field in Birmingham. It exploded with more talk around the papers. The LA Times jumped in even before the Georgia game, saying Alabama was basically on a par with Dartmouth, and Alabama got the Champ Pickens Trophy as the champion of the Southern Conference. That was named for an Alabama booster.
So the University of Alabama to be considered in the same breath with schools like Dartmouth and Colgate would be tantamount today to a program that was maybe lesser being on par with today, Alabama or Georgia. For us to imagine a world where we were that far off the national stage, and yet that was really the case then. Well, you mentioned the song, so let's turn the corner on that for just a second and talk about the line in there about the Rose Bowl. Remember the Rose Bowl, we'll win then. And that line making its way into the fight song.
Not only was he a good journalist, but he had a flair for music. And as some of his friends said, he had a penchant for piano. He could play that piano and he could compose music. He wrote the song and he played it at a fraternity house on campus for a few friends the first time. And then it caught on. It was, it didn't catch on in time for the game itself, but Rammer Jammer later in the following spring published the lyrics to it, published the composition. Ep Sykes used his money, which I thought was pretty cool.
Oh, and you hear this story though, and there's so much about it that's just incredible. I mean, the fact that this group of young men from all over the state of Alabama, most of them probably had hardly been outside the state of Alabama before the opportunity to play football here, and now they have the opportunity to go to the Rose Bowl.
We had beaten the Bulldogs in our last game of the season on Thanksgiving Day to secure the Rose Bowl bid.
Right. I just feel like that, it had been written about the train, but we look back at individual stories, hundreds of stories from the rides. So it got to be incredible. The New York Times, from the New York Times to the LA Times to the Seattle, all the way across the country, these dispatches were making headlines of the Alabama team. This was a major cold that gripped the country, coming all the way down to Tuscaloosa, Birmingham, freezing temperatures then. But as they went further north, the more snow and all of that, and to see some of the dispatches, there's no describing this freak of nature that spreads 13 miles across, 17 miles long, and is 8,000 feet deep.
Wow.
Those cars were falling all over themselves trying to describe this place that they had never seen.
Coach Wade loaded up the bus and said, we're going to go on a trip. And they went out to an orange grove and picked 2 oranges each. And that was their entertainment. They got to pick 2 oranges. Imagine 100 years ago, going out to Pasadena and the Rose Bowl, the San Gabriel Mountains, and the beauty of it all. And these guys probably, most of them had never been out of Alabama other than maybe a football trip. to Atlanta or
Right.
Knoxville or wherever. An injury put him out of the game once in the second quarter.
Mm.
He got knocked out and hauled off, literally, and came back in his best Lazarus impression in the fourth quarter, but it was too late. He was out of the game for 22 minutes, and that's when we scored all 20 of our points.
Not bad for a bunch of Southern boys that folks didn't believe belonged there.
They were as much as stars to the stars as the stars were to them when they went and
Yeah.
visited.
But my dad always said that game meant dignity.
Mm. Yeah.
And he always said that it did something for people in the South that was so much bigger than football. And it proved that, we belong.
Well, then when Alabama wins, these people rush into the streets all over the South, including Atlanta, rushing into the streets because they knew the impact was on Southern football. When they arrived in Tuscaloosa, the depot here was packed as far as I could see. It was a huge crowd, so huge that they barely could get off the train. People ran onto the train, started carrying them off, on their shoulders to some extent, taking them to these wagons that were going to take them through downtown Tuscaloosa and then all the way down the UA and the quad and all that.
The Rose Bowl didn't make Alabama great. It revealed what Alabama already was. And the Tide were going to be invited back again. And at that point, belief was going to turn into expectation.